My contribution today, I think, is less of an argument and more of a progress report. So I hope you'll indulge me. I think you'll find it interesting nevertheless. It is no accident that narrative votive panels found their voice as word-image composites at precisely the same time that the European broadsheet was flexing its muscle as a technique of mass communication. As twin descendants of the Christian miracle legend, both genres of micronarrative fed a growing public appetite for human interest stories and represented new ways for individuals and groups to appear in public. It's also no accident that both genres of micronarrative, the votive panel and the broadsheet, emerged in the context of pilgrimage culture. My example on the right is one of the earliest surviving broadsheets associated with the German pilgrimage, titled A Gruesome Story That Happened in Passau. It relates the story of the Jewish sacrilege against the Eucharist, the punishment of the perpetrators, and the founding of a new pilgrimage shrine. The upper portion was printed separately and distributed as a type of pilgrimage souvenir. The text block below was added later for the broadsheet's second edition. Unlike the printed broadsheet, which was produced in multiples and portable enough to be carried anywhere, the votive panel was a unique object, uniquely situated, a personalized object, one that told its story on behalf of an individual to a specific audience at a specific locale. Early narrative votives, like the examples preserved at the Shrine of Our Lady in Altötting, the Great Marian Pilgrimage in Lower Bavaria, testify to the healing mercy of a celestial helper saint. At once a miracle tale, the record of a gift, and a social mirror aimed at the pilgrimage public, the votive image showcased the tribulations and crises of contemporary life, encapsulated in simple stories of misfortune, each starring its own representative character. In this case, oops, I'm sorry, I meant to point. I jumped ahead. In this case, anyway, the case on the left, we have one Oswald Dienstel, who recovered from a dire illness once he pledged to visit the Virgin at Altötting. The message of these early votive tafeln was not simply that the Virgin Mary, the merciful Mother of God, would always assist the unfortunate in their hour of need, but that her powers were uniquely manifest in this particular place. Grace could, in theory, flow anywhere. It was the job of pilgrimage promoters to show that it was especially abundant and efficacious here, in this station of grace, or Gnadenort. Here we come upon a fundamental condition for the votive gift as a social medium: its insertion into an ongoing stream of donations, its role in an accumulative and collaborative effort of lay people and clergy to proclaim the healing presence of the saint at a particular place, and the resulting merger of the story it tells, stereotyped or otherwise, with countless others. Yet that merger into the collective, we must remember, never ruled out the possibility that one donor's votive gift could rise above others. Size and quality of manufacture, the cost or weight of materials, the social rank or recognizability of the donor, the proximity of the gift to the cult image in its shrine, all of these factors could bestow on the votive gift a privileged status. But another kind of privileged status was possible before the German votive Tafel fully came into its own: the novelty of the transitional object, quote unquote. I put transitional in quotes. The object in which a new way of performing a traditional but non-prescribed ritual task is tested out. This too could confer distinction on its donor and, under the right conditions, fertilize the ground for a new genre's growth. Keeping in mind that accidents of survival can mislead us into thinking something is foundational or transitional, I want to inquire into one object today that bears all the functions that would later become standard for the German pilgrimage votive Tafel after 1500. All, that is, except a clear-cut connection to a particular shrine. Here I show the votive panel of one Ludwig Klinkhammer, a knight who was wounded in the Battle of Caliano of 1487. This was the decisive battle in the larger conflict between the Counts of Tyrol and the Venetian Republic. Fatigued, dazed, and bleeding profusely, horse and rider limp their way home after the battle has been fought. With his cuirass blasted open, his right arm mangled, and the left one torn off, the knight lets the shattered reins fall from his grip. Meanwhile, his trusty steed is shown with a lance stuck in his flank and a great semicircular chunk carved out of his withers, the cartoon-like result, the painter tells us, of a direct hit from a falconet cannonball which is visible on the ground, smeared in blood. There. To medieval as well as modern eyes, the duo's halting, abject march through the countryside might appear as a kind of send-up of the mounted warrior's headlong charge into battle, an anti-memorial, as it were, to the condottieri's victory and fame. Nor does the depiction exude much of the melancholy remembrance of martial glory, such as we find in Carl Friedrich Lessing's canvas of the Last Crusader returning from the Holy Land. In its unvarnished depiction of the walking wounded, the Klinkhammer panel is perhaps closer in spirit to those wartime images showing the return of troops from the front lines, a veritable subgenre of war photography in the 20th century. As we read in the votive panel's legend, it was outside the fortress of Rovereto that Klinkhammer and his equine companion were dealt the fateful blow. Addressing the beholder, the panel recalls the moment of peril. Here's the legend. I, Ludwig Klinkhammer, was shot with a falconet cannonball below the fortress of Rovereto in the Venetian War. Thereupon I called upon our beautiful lady, our merciful lady with her beautiful child, and the little boy from Trent, who helped me, so that by their mercy I survived. For as soon as I pledged myself to the Mother of God, all this came to pass, for which I gave thanks to God, Anno Domini 1487. A situation of desperation and fear, a hopeful appeal to a celestial helper, a pledge of fealty, a miraculous rescue, and an expression of thanks enshrined in perpetuity. These features of the Klinkhammer panel would become more or less standardized in the Catholic tradition of votive giving for the next 400 years. But alongside the features that would, we know from hindsight, become conventional, there are several remarkable things about the Klinkhammer votive, thus several clues to follow in retracing its career and illuminating its function. Few of you missed the fact that the wounded knight appeals not to one, but to two celestial helpers, and only one of the two is linked to a specific locale in the legend. In addition to our merciful lady and her beautiful child, Klinkhammer's tale of rescue invokes late medieval Europe's most famous victim of Jewish ritual murder, the boy martyr Simon of Trent. Here we see him in the upper right, naked and radiating sanctity, opposite the Virgin and Child. He holds two symbols of martyrological triumph, the cross emblazoned vexillum, and a shield bearing the so-called arma simoni, the nails that pierced his body, the pincers that tore his flesh, the knife used for circumcising or, in some accounts, castrating him, and the bronze basin used to collect his blood. Assuming that Klinkhammer's votive was made within a few years of the wartime incident it narrates, we find ourselves very much in the heyday of Simonino's cult, and also not far from its epicenter, the bilingual city of Trent, in the Sud-Tyrol region of Italy, and the southernmost city in Germania, according to travelers of the time. Despite early papal opposition and the suspicion of fabrications in the trial against the Jews, the cult saw a meteoric rise to local, regional, and even trans-regional prominence in the 10 years following Simon's discovery. Northern Italy saw a rapid proliferation of imagery devoted to the saint in cities like Brescia, Bergamo, Padua, Mantua, and Venice, not only in the frescoes, altar panels, and carvings you see here, but prints as well. Small-scale devotionalia dedicated to the child martyr and apparently designed for domestic display was also in demand. Here I show a polychromed relief from around 1500 by the Brixen sculptor Hans Klocker, whose image of Simonino is adapted from a New Year's engraving by the master E.S., a German engraver. I pause to highlight the Klocker relief simply to point out that in the county of Tyrol, the Alpine territories between Trent and southern Germany proper, the cult's diffusion was nearly as rapid and deep as it was in northern Italy. Historian Ronnie Shah has called the Tyrol a region plagued by legends of blood accusations, and for good reason. After some initial opposition, Duke Sigismund of Habsburg affirmed the propriety of the trial and embraced the dynamic of the cult. Sigismund's nephew and successor at Innsbruck, Maximilian I, soon after his ascension to the German throne in 1486, likewise became a strong proponent of the cult, ordering a silver monument to be erected in Simon's honor and having the martyr's relics displayed during a procession. Against this background, Little Simon's cameo as the object of Ludwig Klinkhammer's devotion shouldn't be all that surprising, but it is. The invocation of the boy martyr of Trent on a narrative votive panel is, to the best of my knowledge, unique. Surely other votives testifying to Simon's intercessionary powers once existed, and surely their preeminent space of display was the shrine housing his relics at San Pietro's in Trent. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, all of this accumulated devotionalia, along with Simon's shriveled, blackened mummy, were removed from the city in the wake of Pope Paul VI's official foreclosure of the cult in 1965. In a situation where the original location of Klinkhammer's votive cannot be clearly documented, then, shall we simply assume that it was once destined for the boy martyr's shrine in Trent, or must we look elsewhere? What we know of its provenance does not allow for such easy assumptions. Relevant external facts about its early whereabouts are limited to two, and each points in a different direction. First is the panel's current home, the treasury of Stift Wilten, a Premonstratensian monastery in Innsbruck, founded in 1138. Historians writing for the 850-year jubilee of Stift Wilten accepted the comfortable assumption that the Klinkhammer votive was among the many deposited there over the centuries in honor of their patroness, Maria unter den vier Säulen, a virgin and child group venerated in Wilten's parish church since at least the mid-14th century, and now celebrated as the Gnadenbild of the Baroque basilica there. Within its collection of about 50 votives, Klinkhammer's is one of only three, that predate the Reformation, and all three of them are completely unrelated to one another. Just show them to you quickly. The oldest of the three depicts the Austrian Duke Friedrich IV of Habsburg, nicknamed mit der leeren Tasche, with the empty pockets, being offered refuge from God's arrows under the Virgin's mantle, a variation on the late medieval Schutzmantel Madonna, with no attached inscription and no proclaimed association with the cult image at Wilten. The third votive in this group, which does include a legend at the bottom here and a date, 1490, stars a young nobleman kneeling at the foot of the throne of mercy. Two auxiliary scenes in the lower corners show the devotee enduring judicial tortures from which the Virgin's mercy, the legend explains, had rescued him. But here again, the attributes of the Virgin, who takes her place opposite John the Baptist in a modified deesis, are a poor match for Stift Wilten's Madonna. So who knows if any of Stift Wilten's pre-1500 votives are original to that place at all? Consider instead the likelihood that Klinkhammer's votive may not have arrived in Innsbruck much earlier than the Second World War. This possibility comes from the researches of Gustav Gugitz, who published his 5-volume topographical handbook of Austrian shrines between 1955 and 1958. In his entry for the parish church at Riffian, a village located approximately 100 kilometers south of Innsbruck across the Italian border, Gugitz noted the presence of several old war votives, alte Kriegsvotivtafeln, bearing the dates of 1449, 1487, 1508, 1511, and 1797, respectively. Scholars, including Lenz Chris Rettenbeck, took the item dated 1487 to refer to the Klinkhammer votive. And although no one has offered much corroborating evidence for this, the case for identification can be strengthened by comparing it to one of the items on Gugitz's list. The item number 1, quite tantalizing in my view, is a war votive bearing the false date, the later added wrong date of 1449. Known only through photographs, the panel commemorates the Tyrolean triumph over the Venetians at Caliano, the very same conflict that prompted the Klinkhammer votive. The scene centers on two titanic knightly figures overcome by what appear to be flaming boulders, presumably cannonballs, that are being hurled down from an elevated terrain held by a Venetian force, identified by their battle standard up here, which is a winged lion. The two were united in what appears to be a stop-action sequence depicting a single warrior's fall. Rhymed verses narrate the miraculous aid granted to the outnumbered and battered Austrian forces, and I won't read the inscription to you. It's worth pointing out, pause here for a minute, it's worth pointing out that perceptions of celestial assistance in repelling an enemy or enduring the cruel aftermath of a military conflict persisted as a feature of German Catholic votive culture in the succeeding centuries. Witness this fascinating post-war votive offered by a former German POW attributing his safe return from a Soviet prison camp to the Gnadenbild of the scourged Savior. The panel shown here was deposited at Lengries in Upper Bavaria, the site of a Passion itinerary, or Kalvarienberg. More important is the fact that we have two votives commemorating the same battle at the same shrine at Riffian. This encourages us, first of all, to see Riffian's image of the sorrowing mother, who is visible in the upper corner of the first of the older votive, in the ancient tradition of Palladia, goddess images that ensured the safety of cities and its defenders in times of crisis. At the same time, we have to acknowledge the differences between the two war votives. Unlike Klinkhammer's, the dedication of the Caliano votive at Riffian is a foregone conclusion. The hovering Gnadenbild is an unambiguous reference to the Riffian pilgrimage, which for centuries would center on a polychromed Pietà enshrined behind the high altar in the Baroque parish church. It's consecrated in 1671. Here is a shot of the exterior. Every lecture needs a picture of Klaus. This cult image of the Schmerzhaften Mutter Gottes appears consistently across the small collection of early modern votive images today kept in situ, which have clearly been curated for the edification of modern visitors. By contrast, the Virgin and Child in the Klinkhammer's votive conforms to the iconography of the Mulier Amicta Sole, the woman clothed in the sun, described in Revelations. Go back to that just for a second. A type that was widespread in the Imperial South. So why Riffian? Did Klinkhammer have a personal, family, or corporate connection with the place that the documents have yet to yield up? Had he once visited as a pilgrim? Was the shrine acclaimed by Tyrolean knights, or particularly the veterans of Caliano? Any one of these connections, if borne out by further research, would highlight the commemorative function of Klinkhammer's panel, which still, at this early stage in the history of the German votive tafel, supersedes its function as a reciprocal gift to a celestial patron identified with a particular shrine. Now, before concluding, we must return to the possibility raised by Klinkhammer's devotion to the boy martyr of Trent. Could his votive have once been intended for deposit and display at the shrine of Little Simon, a cult center that lay 100 kilometers to the south of Riffian and even farther from Innsbruck? Again, a few facts must stand in for a multifarious whole. By the mid-1480s, devotion to Simonino was in full swing, and the shrine of San Pietro was fully decked out with devotionalia and votive gifts. For pilgrims, it was the main stop on a whole itinerarium mentis, a Simon-themed topographical tour that included the house where the child saint was born, the Jew Samuel's house where his body was discovered, and the special chapel in San Pietro where his mortal remains were displayed for collective veneration. Signs of the votive accumulation there appear in the earliest printed propaganda for the Simon cult. For example, the colored woodcut today in Munich, which shows votive hands, feet, crutches, and figurines hanging like garlands around the ravaged body. A similar collection appears in the image that actually served as the prototype for the one on the left, that is the broadsheet describing Simon's martyrdom in 50 verses by the humanist physician Giovanni Maria Tiburino. Of course, such summary, conventionalized depictions could not be counted as straight-up documentary evidence, but the abundant presence of ex-votos in the San Pietro shrine, noted in both contemporary and later sources, can hardly be doubted. Whether the saint's collection of devout gifts included painted panels at such an early date is, however, open to question. At contemporary Italian shrines, the practice of depositing tavolette votiva did not become an established form of giving and commemoration until the last decade of the 15th century. And while it is likely that German pilgrims may have begun leaving their own votive tafeln at regional shrines around the same time, the earliest survivors, such as those at Altötting, all post-date 1500 as we've seen. Given that Klinkhammer's votive predates the generalized coming into use of narrative tavoletti, it seems unlikely then that San Pietro was its intended destination. Now, nearby San Pietro was another institution that may have commanded Ludwig Klinkhammer's allegiance, and so it too must figure in our story, if only in passing. In the final quarter of the 15th century, let's go back to this. In the final quarter of the 15th century, Trent hosted a large and prominent German community. Concentrated in the neighborhood around San Pietro, the Germans of Trent had long gathered in the bishop's church to hear sermons in their own language. This gave them front row seats, as it were, to the spectacular rise and entrenchment of the Little Simon cult. Among the community's pious institutions, one deserves special mention in light of the events of 1487, the Deutsches Spital, or Ospedale Alemano, also called the Hospital in St. Peter's Parish because of its location. Founded in the mid-13th century, it possessed its own chapel by 1270, and eventually served as the home base for the charitable activities of the Zappatori, a pious confraternity also known as the Ackerbürger Bruderschaft. Imperial and patriotic in character, the hospital chapel also enshrined the family names of 38 German and Tyrolean knights who fought in the Battle of Caliano. Rendered in oil, I don't have a picture, so you have to imagine it, rendered in oil, each on its own canvas, the family crests of these patriot soldiers were lavishly displayed on a wooden grating that announced itself to visitors as Urkunden der berühmten siegreichen Schlacht von Caliano. Its effect would not have been unlike the post-medieval displays of German family crests inside the Cathedral of Our Lady in Tallinn, Estonia, or in Stockholm's Riddarholmskirken. Now, one would expect to find our man Klinkhammer among the hallowed ranks of the Caliano veterans, a roll call that includes both South German and Tyrolean knights. But remarkably, for reasons not yet clear to me, that's not the case. He's not there. Keep the timer at bay. Although it's clear that Klinkhammer identified with the cult of Simonino, his votive, in my opinion, was never deposited for display at the boy martyr's tomb. As an ethnic German and a knight in the service of the Habsburgs, he no doubt had some familiarity with the German community of Trent, and almost certainly passed through the city during wartime, either on his way south from Tyrol to the Venetian strongholds contested by Sigismund, or on his return from battle, wounded and needing medical attention. Now, Trent is only about 27 kilometers due north of Castel Rovereto, the site that gave its name to the larger conflict that climaxed at Caliano. So it's tempting to imagine the wounded Klinkhammer attributing his survival to the Virgin and the little boy from Trent, stopping in that city to pay allegiance to both to the celestial helper Simon and the imagined community galvanized around his cult, a community that included his fellow German knights and the princes for whom they fought. Perhaps the wounded man even convalesced at the Deutsches Spital, afterward then attributing his survival to the intervention of the local martyr. Then, finally, at the end of a long journey home, to commemorate his adventure, he commissioned this pictorial thank offering from Innsbruck's most prominent painter and displayed it at a nearby Marian shrine to which he had some connection. At any rate, what's clear is that Ludwig Klinkhammer entrusted a new genre, a novel form of social media, with the work of commemorating his miraculous survival, thanking his celestial helpers, and telling his story. Record of sacrifice, suffering, and true grit, testimony to the healing mercy bestowed by his heavenly helpers, token of allegiance to the imperial cause, Ludwig Klinkhammer's narrative votive is a precious survival, a transitional object still not quite at home in any of our established art historical categories, and all the more fascinating because of it. Thank you.